got an amazing show lined up for you guys today. We are joined by author John Olsen, who is with us. He was raised in a farmhouse that was built in the 1880s, and he had his very first paranormal experience at about 8 years old. He spent the last 30 years interviewing and documenting firsthand accounts of those dealing with the paranormal, and he's the author of the Stranger Bridgerland series of books. There is 8 in total, the 8th to be released this year. The new book is called Stranger Utah, and if you want to learn more about John and all of his work, head over to strangerbridgeland.com. But I don't know about you guys, but I'm excited to get into this. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Paranormal Portal Podcast. I'm your host, Brent Thomas. Thank you all for joining us, and special thank you goes out to all of you who continue to support the podcast and continue to spread the word. Always remember, if any of you out there have experiences of your own that you'd like to share, feel free to email me at paranormalportalradio@gmail.com. Again, paranormalportalradio@gmail.com, and you too could be a guest on the show. Hey, John, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Brent. This is a lot of fun, and I appreciate being on the show.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I really admire that not only do you have experiences, but that became a catalyst for you to dedicate 30 years of your life into following and tracking this stuff down. But I guess kind of the most natural place to start is, where did this begin for you?
Yeah, it began as a little kid. I was born and raised in this house. Like you mentioned, it was built in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't long, probably like you said, by the time I was 8, I realized that there were things going on in my house that didn't happen in my friend's house. And, I have an older sister and a younger brother, and then my mom and dad. And as kids, we experienced everything from footsteps in the hall, on the staircase, to things moving, things disappearing, things appearing that we didn't own in the house, and, even full body apparitions. Mm. And so, by the time I was, 8 or 9, our parents did not want us to talk about it outside of the home. I grew up in a small town in northern Utah, and the saying I have is, when you grow up in a small town, there's 2 things that you like to do. That's gossip and try not to be gossip. So we were trying not to be gossip. But because of that, I kind of, dove into and tried to learn everything I could, and it just really piqued my interest, not only about, ghosts and the things that I was experiencing, but everything about the paranormal. And so, for the longest time, until I was a teenager, I just read and watched everything I could, just over and over again. And later on in my life, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which made a lot of sense when I was a kid, because I hyper focused on the paranormal, which I have all my life. And so, like I said, I learned everything I could with the experiences that I've had. And by the time I was a teenager, I had friends that would come over to my house, and they had experiences. And I had to admit to my friends, oh yeah, I grew up in a haunted house. And so I started telling stories. They asked me to tell stories at parties and double dates. And before long, people started bringing me their stories, and I started hunting them down too. Trying to find these stories. What's really important to me in my books is that I'm able to interview the person that it actually happened to, so that it's first person. And for a long time, when I didn't have internet, which people have a hard time believing. My kids have a hard time believing that we never had the internet.
Sure.
It was harder to hunt down people. But after my first book was published, about 9 years ago, It's been a lot easier with a website and things like that, because now I have stories from all over the world that I've collected and are still collecting. In my last book that was out last year, Stranger World, I had stories from England and Germany, Australia and Brazil. And so it's just been a really fun, fascinating journey. And just to be able to talk to people and have their trust in giving me their stories, I really appreciate.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I guess that's a parallel between our two worlds, because of course doing a show, I talk to people from all over the world as well. And sometimes, I don't know, and maybe it shouldn't, but it surprises me that there's such a continuity between, people's experiences. Like there does seem to be at least a rudimentary formula for how these things develop, in a sense. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I definitely would. And what's fascinating, some of the fascinating things that's happened to me on this journey, for example, is I will get a story from someone that is something I'd never heard of before happening. And I'll publish that story thinking it's a one-off kind of thing. But then the number of people who kind of come out of the woodwork and say, I thought I was the only one that had an experience like that. And it just kind of snowballs with those stories. I'll give you a quick example. In one of my first books, I interviewed a gentleman who here in northern Utah used to camp with his family in the summer, and their extended family. They would all go camping up in the mountains here. And when he was around 10 years old, him and all the cousins were playing hide and seek, and he was supposed to be the one seeking. And one of the cousins was a couple of years older than him, and he really looked up to his cousin. And while he's trying to find everybody, he notices his cousin is out of camp near the canyon, and his cousin is motioning for him to follow him. And so he's like, we're playing hide and seek. That's not very good at hiding. But he goes to where his cousin was, and he's not there. And he notices further up the trail, up this little canyon, his cousin again, who's motioning to follow. And he goes up there, and his cousin's gone. And again, it's farther up the canyon. And he follows his cousin up the canyon quite a ways till he realizes, I'm really far away from camp. I'm not supposed to be this far. And he kind of wigs out and runs all the way back to camp. Well, when he gets there, sitting on by the fire having a hot dog is his cousin. Mm. And he's like, what are you doing trying to lure me away from camp? Or trying to get me to follow you? And his mother's like, he was hiding underneath the trailer. He's been here the whole time. So it was something out there was mimicking, looking like his cousin, trying to lure him, further and further away. Wow. So I got that story and I wrote it thinking it was a one-off. And the number of people who contacted me saying they had similar experiences as kids, where either a cousin or something like that was an older brother or even a friend that they looked up to, were trying to lure them into the forest or even into abandoned buildings. And even the number of stories that happened that were in that very same area where the original story came from. There was two that came from within a mile of that original story. And so, like you say, it's fascinating when you get something and then there's continuity all the way around of this happening. It not only, makes you curious about what's going on, but it solidifies that last story as well, kind of, to those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And phenomena like that is incredibly troublesome, because when you think, as a person who's heard stories, and of course you cover so many different things, and even in my case, I cover, cryptids, UFOs, and spiritual, and then strange phenomena. And you kind of want to, like, at least I do, as I'm hearing a story like that, I'm trying to think, well, is that just a lonely spirit? Is it some form of like doppelganger that has ulterior motives of some kind? Could it potentially be a skinwalker? There's so many things that jump into my mind. As you're hearing stories like that, do you jump to what is it, or do you just leave it as the person's testimony and that's good enough?
Sometimes, well, most of the time I'll try and look into it. And for example, I got, after, this happened and I got a few more stories, I tried to look into it and see if there was any connections, through folklore or, anything like that. And it's very interesting because there's several, Native American folklore, especially up in Alaska, that talks about, spirits that do this very same thing to try and lure kids off into the forest.
Oh,
and
wow.
and it also has connections with the Fae in Europe, that there was a lot of stories and a lot of folklore about kids trying to be lured into the forest or replaced by doppelgangers, and they have a specific name I can't remember, but so it's really fascinating to me what it could be. I'm not one that I say, well, it has to be this, but I love searching through to try and, back up the stories with folklore or with other stories, or trying to connect the dots and figure out what it might be. So, it could be any one of those things for sure.
Right. Do you think that potentially the people who experience that are in potentially mortal danger, or do you think is it just more mischievous?
It makes me wonder, especially with the number of kids that go missing in the forest, and along with the missing 411, which I actually love that series. It makes me wonder what it could be, and is there stories of people who followed too far,
Right.
So
Yeah.
and or is it just maybe a mischievous spirit trying to get them in trouble, or it's any number of things like that. But like you say, it's just such a strange world we live in. So
yeah, and it's as I started doing this show, and I've told the story many times, so forgive the redundancy to any of my normal listeners, but I really thought, I can do this kind of show. I know all about this stuff. And then you start going into the rabbit hole and you realize, I don't know anything about all this stuff. This is crazy. You never realize how in depth and how diversified and yet similar these experiences are. And I tend to be kind of a logical person, so I'm always trying to, dot the I's and cross the T's, but this is not a subject matter that lends itself real well to that, right?
right, exactly. Yeah, it's one of those things that is way out there for sure. And it's one of those things too, like you were mentioning, you'd think after 30 years, I'd be like, oh, I've seen it all or heard it all. But it's amazing how many times I get a story from somebody and it just blows my mind, and it opens up a new door and makes me wonder, what is this? I'm not sure how this is connected. But
Now, inversely, you as an author, you must get a lot of people reaching out to you. Are there, and I don't mean this in a judgmental, horrible way, but I find myself battling with this sometimes in myself, and it's I come up against my own personal paradigm when I'm hearing personal stories of other people, and I try to always remain as open as I can, because I couldn't possibly know all the things that are possible or impossible, or if that's even a thing. Is there even impossible? But do you sometimes run up against stories that's like, God, I just can't do anything with this. I can't wrap my head around it, so I can't put it in there. Do you have to filter sometimes as well, or do you choose not to, or what is your take on that?
so I've got a stack still of stories, that are not in books right now. And I have like I said, I've got a few criteria. One, I have to, interview from the person that it comes from. My editor, which is also my lovely wife, helps me, to pick through as well. There's been, in all of that time, there's been very few times where I've interviewed somebody and I have to go by my gut. Like, when you're listening or talking to somebody, it's amazing. There's been so few times when I just feel like they're feeding me a story. If that makes sense.
Oh, it does. Yeah. Absolutely.
But for some reason I can really tell if somebody is, but it's been very rare. And the only stories that I try to avoid to write about are stories where people where it's more demonic, I guess you could say, and somebody went looking for it. Those are kind of the things that I've written a couple stories about Ouija boards, but when I did it, the people that gave me those stories, their criteria were it has to be written from a point of caution, don't do this kind of a thing. That was their caveat. If I write it, make sure you don't, make it sound fun, because it was not, and I want people to know it's not a good idea. So, there's been a few stories that I've collected, because I still collect everything, where it may be very much more demonic, where somebody was doing something that they probably shouldn't have and ran into it, just because I don't like, I guess, encouraging that, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's fantastic. And I think you're right. I think that there has to be some kind of intrinsic responsibility for you as the person compiling these stories to be like, well, I certainly don't want other people to follow this pathway, so, I'm going to keep this one out. And yeah, because I think in a lot of ways, and maybe it's our popular culture that's really lent a lot to this taking off and becoming more of an issue. But I think with the plethora of ghost shows, both on, online streaming platforms, videos on demand, and of course, network television, it kind of gives people the idea that, look, you just buy these pieces of equipment and you go to all these creepy places and you have this really amazing time. And then next week they're somewhere else. So, it's fine. You can do this. And I think it's maybe led people to a whole bunch of unrealistic expectations about what going into these places can mean, or the ramifications of those actions that can impact your life and those around you. And yeah, I think that's incredibly responsible that you look at it that way.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that as well, because I don't go out and do the ghost hunting thing. I do get invited by groups, and my wife and I'll go around Halloween and stuff with different groups, or if it's part of a podcast or something. But there are a few groups around here, and I have a few that I trust. If somebody's having an issue in their home, that I work with them, and I work with the people of the home, because, a lot of times you see, like you say on television, I relate it to, if you had a hornet infestation in your house, you wouldn't want to wouldn't want to hire an exterminator that just came in and beat it with a bat and got the wasps mad and then left, because that's not what an exterminator, not that, you're not exterminating the ghosts, but a lot of times you see in these shows, they go in and they provoke and they get angry and they do this, and then next week they're off at somebody else's house. And I keep thinking, those poor people that live there are now living with something really angry because they just came in and stirred everything up and left. But
yeah, exactly. That's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah, I do a little investigating myself, but I've really enjoyed it, and I try to go about it, incredibly respectful, because, not that this is an interview about investigating, but I think that oftentimes, again, those medias give us an unrealistic expectation that these spirits are just there to entertain us and do things for us, and that's, I think, for whatever reason, they're earthbound, and they're working through maybe what's keeping them here, and the last thing they need is someone coming in and, asking them to jump through hoops and stuff. That's got to be incredibly condescending and disrespectful. So yeah, that's a good point. So how has this, through the years of doing this, how has this shaped your view of the paranormal, or how has your view of these things changed over time?
It's just kind of evolved with the depth and the differences of the paranormal out there, if that makes sense. Because, I write stories from all different aspects and all different things, from ghosts, cryptids, glitches in the matrix, and all, everything. And so what's really kind of, I guess, not necessarily changed, but solidified to me, is just how strange this world really is. And I laugh at I'm not anti-science whatsoever. I love science, but I listen to some, scientists that are like, oh, there's no way we could have UFOs because there's no way to travel faster than light and everything. And I laugh because, there's a letter written from the president of the patent office in 1895 to the president of the United States saying we should close the patent office because everything that's been invented has already been invented and we shouldn't do this anymore. And that was right before we got the airplane, we got, all of this stuff. And so, what we don't know could fill volumes and volumes. So, and that's everybody, no matter how much you've studied. So,
yeah, absolutely. And again, this is the great unknown. I think that paranormal is the great unknown and probably stands to teach us a whole bunch if we're, continue to look. And as I've said on other interviews as well, I think it really does fall in line with what Tesla was talking about in exploring the non-physical, and how that could teach us more in a decade than we've learned in all combined history. And maybe this is part of that. Maybe this is the non-physical manifesting itself, or at least some dynamics of the reality we live in and how it's, the interplays with us. But I do want to talk with you about cryptids too, because I'm extraordinarily fascinated in this subject and being a person that has, looked into this quite heavily yourself. First question I would have to ask is, what is the most common type of cryptid reported for you?
It's Sasquatch is probably the most that I've actually been able to get stories from. So especially living here in the mountains of northern Utah, some of the a lot of them were close here when I first started, of course, but yeah, definitely Sasquatch, and that's probably the one that I would love the most to see myself. And but yeah, that's probably the one that stands out the most, I guess.
Yeah, well, be careful what you wish for first.
Right.
Yeah.
I know.
But I have to wonder about, being you're in Utah, and of course you're kind of in the ballpark of the Uinta Basin then, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
There's all kinds of strangeness going on there. Of course, it's the home of the Skinwalker Ranch. So do you hear many experiences people have with things like skinwalkers?
Yeah, actually. And I think that skinwalker in general has kind of become a blanket statement for a lot of different things out there,
Sure.
that happen to people. But, I have gotten quite a few, skin stories that I would believe would fall under skinwalkers for sure. In my new book that's coming out, like you mentioned, it's Stranger Utah. I've come back to Utah for this one because I was collecting quite a few stories here from Utah again. And one of the stories that I love that I actually interviewed the gentleman a couple months ago. He was, in the 70s, he was a professor, of archaeology. So he's an archaeologist, very well-educated individual. And they were working on an Anasazi ruins near the Four Corners of Utah. And they noticed if they stayed too late near dark, these giant balls of light, roughly the size of a basketball, would show and basically follow them out of the site. And they were kind of like trying to figure out, because they're all very scientific. And one night everybody left but him, and he was working and it was starting to get late. And around the site, he started hearing, something walking all the way around the site. And he just got super scared, which you would. He ran back down to where his vehicle was parked. He could hear this, whatever it was that was super heavy and big thing following him. And he got to his car and got out of there really quick. Well, at the time he in the 70s, he was just barely one of the, I don't want to say lower tier, but he wasn't in charge of the site. But he got the archaeologist that was in charge of the site to go back with him the next morning. And both of them scientists, and they walked in, and where this thing had walked around the site, they found, these huge wolf tracks. Now, there aren't wolves down there anymore. They're, and especially in the 70s, they definitely, weren't around. Well, they followed the wolf tracks, and it had come down, and then this wolf had chased him to the parking lot. And when he left, and they followed the wolf tracks, and they went off from the park, where he'd been parking, and they followed him down through the sagebrush and everything. And about 100 yards from where it left there, they slowly morphed into human bare feet tracks. And at that point, they both left. Oof. He tried to talk to the other archaeologist, which he refused to have the conversation and talk about. But from then on, the head archaeologist of the site said everyone will be out of there by 4:00. Wow. Which was a couple hours before dark. No one's there before after dawn. That is the time we will work from 10 till 4. No one will be there before. No one will be there after. So, and what I love about that story is it definitely dealt with a shapeshifter. And you're talking about two individuals who are scientifically trained having this experience. So, there's definitely stories here in Utah about skinwalkers. That's just one of my favorites, and it's going to be in my new book. But it's just fascinating and awesome. I love it.
Yeah, that stuff is so mind-numbingly confusing as well as fascinating. The legends go back, hundreds or maybe even more years that I'm aware of. But the skinwalker thing, you're right. The other thing, though, is I think you're also right about the idea that everything becomes a skinwalker, and that's not the way you said it, but that's me paraphrasing it. But in several experiences, and I think it's because most people only have a few terms to choose from. Well, it wasn't a big foot like a human foot, so it's a wolf-like foot or canine. Must be a skinwalker or a dogman or anything else. But the interplay between these orb things and Bigfoots and potentially dogman too. I mean, I can't know for sure, but it's fascinating. But the transformation part of that is just like, wow. And it's something earlier I said that there's parts where I kind of run into a wall, logically. It's like, how does something transform physically from one thing into another? I mean, there are obviously prints that were left, so it had mass, it had, it had weight, it was physically present, at least in some regard, enough to make tracks into the strata of the earth. But then it became something else completely. And it's like, wow. I mean, it's such a mind bake when you try to wrap your head around that. This is kind of asking you a real curveball question, but do you believe things like that are possible? And I mean, just whatever your opinion is fine, but I'm honestly curious because like I said, I run into walls. I don't know how to process this.
Right. Exactly. It is really hard to process. And, to answer your question, I do personally believe, that things like that can happen. Mm-hmm. How it happens, I don't know. It's kind of like, same along the lines, like we talked about the fact that I have not personally seen Sasquatch, but that I've interviewed so many people and these are, honest, good people. Like you just get the feeling because a lot of them, when they're telling you the story, they go right back to that time and get emotional in times. And so I can't prove or disprove it, but in my gut, I'm like, yeah, stuff like that can happen, and it's super strange and weird. But at the same time, it gets me excited about the paranormal. I mean, that spark of wanting to know more and how it happens, and it is. But deep in my gut, I would say yes, but I have no physical proof myself. Right. If that makes any sense.
It does. And I guess I believe it's possible too. It's just, again, the other side, like the right brain says, yeah, that's possible. And my left brain goes, but how? What's going on? And I don't claim to have any answers. I will say that I think it's also important to note that transfiguration or transformation is not a new concept, and it's certainly not unique to the Skinwalkers. It's been shamanistically claimed for aeons or millennia, throughout the world that their witch doctors or shamans or whatever you want to call them could transform from themselves into other things, and completely so. And where did they get that idea? Well, a lot of people maybe in our Western thinking would say, it's smoke and mirrors, just like a magician's trick. But what if it's not? What if they very clearly saw and witnessed this and just, it was a matter of their life. It was just a matter of fact, just like, you go to the grocery store and pick up milk and these holy people or these shamanistic people can just do that. Yeah. And so, I think it's fascinating though. Do you get reports about dogmen?
I have gotten a few.
Okay.
Not a lot in the West, a few of them, but back east, I've interviewed people, and I had one really fascinating one up in Canada where this gentleman told him when he was a teenager, him and his dad used to go fishing a lot. They were in Canada, and it was summer, and they were on a lake, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, the name of the lake. Things like that go right. Names are terrible hard for me, but but they were just fishing, and it was late because in the summertime, the sun, it stays bright for a long time. And they coasted into this cove because they were just pitching from the boat, looking for muskie and some other stuff. And all of a sudden, this thing stood up next to the tree near them or stepped out from behind it. And it was, it stood straight up like a man and had arms, a hairy body. But had the head of a black German Shepherd. And it kind of, when it saw him, it kind of crouched a little bit and, pulled back its lips and was snarling at them. He could feel the reverberation in his chest of this growl from this huge thing. And they both were just kind of in shock. And then it just took off running through, off and away. And they fired up the boat, went back to camp, packed up camp and left. But, when I interviewed him, even all these years later, he just got really emotional about it. Like just the fear of going from a fun, evening of fishing to just absolute terror to see something that like you say, in your mind, shouldn't exist, But that one I liked too because they were close enough. He got, really a lot of detail, being able to see the muscles under the skin, the head with the pointy ears that look like a German Shepherd. And, So, and I love those stories too. I love, because they're very rare. I find that those are very rare cryptids or anything like that. So when I'm able to get one of those, I get really excited about that. So,
yeah, they are incredible stories. From what I've heard, there does seem to be at least a pronounced difference between like a Bigfoot sighting and a dogman sighting, whereas the Bigfoot just seems to be like incidental. They might see a Bigfoot, walking in the forest, look over. It knows you're there, but it either doesn't care or it's just not at all worried about you. But the dogman reports tend to seem to be much more aggressive. Like, oh, you're there. Well, I'm going to be right up in your grill and growling at you now. And they're so terrifying to me. I just can't imagine what it is that people are experiencing, but I just know that I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. Whatever it is, I don't want it. It's just terrifying.
Well, and so there's so many stories too. Like you say, they're so much more aggressive. There's stories of them, trying to attack people in their cars, like coming at their cars. And whereas, like you say, when people see Bigfoot, for the most part, it's accidental, and it's almost, they're like, oh, whoops, and trying to get out of there. So
yeah,
yeah,
that's really crazy. So when you started doing all of this documenting, how did you get started? Did you just throw out a thread out on the internet saying, hey, if you've got a story, let me know? Or how did this evolve for you through the years?
So I was about 17 when I started writing down the stories. And so that would have been in like 92.
Okay.
So the internet wasn't even a thing then. My biggest thing was, when I was telling stories, people would come tell me their story, or they would say, hey, oh, this happened to, my brother or my uncle, or, this. And a lot of times it took making phone calls, hunting down these people, which was so much harder back then.
Sure.
If they weren't bringing the stories to me. And like I said, did that for years like that, until really my first book, which was 9 years ago. And I was able to get a website and then put, in my books, I have my email address and my, how to get a hold of me. And so, definitely a lot more flow in now than back then, but because back then it was so much harder, and especially when, back then, you're working full-time job, you're raising a family, but you're trying to find, some individuals out there. So,
yeah, I guess in a lot of ways, the internet has certainly streamlined our ability to communicate in a lot of ways and to share ideas and information. And it makes both of our jobs a lot easier. I don't know how I would ever have accomplished any of this without the internet being the backbone of it all, because it's just, I'm I'm not much of a networker personally, but it's nice when people have that ability. So how do you see this continuing for you into the future?
I'm still collecting stories, and I will continue to do books as long as I, keep getting stories and keep going. So far I haven't seen any, lack of, stories coming in, which is great. Here, I was contacted about a month ago. There's a company out of Salt Lake. They're doing a documentary about paranormal things in Utah, and they've asked me to be there, to come on and talk about it and kind of give them. So, that's really exciting. I do a lot of speaking engagements where I go and talk at universities or at conferences. And so I just see it keep going the way it does, and helping people, get the stories out there. And part of it is very cathartic to the people that get to tell me their story.
Yeah.
They get to get it out, like you said, before, and maybe find other people or hear of other people who've had experiences, because, ghosts are, of course, far and away the most stories that I collect, because I think that happens the most.
Yes.
And so, a lot of those people, they don't even worry about being ridiculed about telling their stories, because one thing I do is change people's names, if they want, and a little bit of the location, just to keep their anonymity. Yes. But, like I said, there's just not a stigma around ghosts really anymore. People are like, oh yeah, ghosts. And now UFOs, since the government is all like, there's totally UFOs. So.
And that brings up another question for me is how often do you get people contacting you regarding sightings or experiences with UFOs?
I get a few. Yeah, I get a few. Some of the problem is they're like, oh, well, I saw a UFO, and it's a quick thing that they saw, which is great. And I record it and everything like that, but it doesn't necessarily make for a great story.
Sure. But
I do get a lot, I will get what I call a diamond in the rough every once in a while, where, for example, there were this individual contacted me, and this is in one of my books. It might have been the last or the one right before. Him and his buddy used to go, we talked about the Uintas. They used to go in the Uintas hiking all the time.
Ooh, okay.
And the biggest thing, and what they love to do is, there's stories of conquistador gold hidden up there, and mines hidden. And so they would go and look, and they love to explore. Well, one night they were camping. They'd hiked up a long ways into this. And this, I believe, was in the 70s or 80s. So it's been a while ago. They spent all day hiking up into this small lake area, and they had eaten, both gone to their tents. And all of a sudden, there's a huge light that flashes, and his buddy gets him up and says, there's something down by the lake. So, they get up and they walk down, and near the lake is a sagebrush flat. And there's a trailer sitting there. It looked like one of those old silver, I can't remember what they're called, the trailers that are kind of domed. And
oh, yeah. The real retro ones. I can't remember.
The retro ones.
Yeah.
And there's lights coming in from inside, and they can see people walking around, and some guy comes to the door, and he's silhouetted from the door, and they're just kind of cussing to themselves. They're like, we didn't see a road, and somebody's built a road up here, and we hiked all the way in here. And so they're kind of cussing to themselves, and they go to bed. And the next day they're like, well, let's not walk down and just find out where this road is and talk to those people. And they went down there. There's no road, and there's only imprints in the sagebrush. And he's like, oh my gosh, that was a UFO. That was something landed out there, and we actually saw the people inside. He's like, that was crazy. But, yeah, so something like that where somebody has an experience where they actually see the occupants, or there's something, very specific about it. And like I say, it's kind of a diamond in the rough, but yeah, it's fun. I do get a lot of people that are like, yeah, I saw a UFO, and I interview them, and they're like, I was, outside, and it just kind of, this huge light went by and everything. And I'm of course it was a UFO, but
sure.
It's
that's quite an expanse of different stories there, though. Yeah. Something is just an incidental sighting, and others was like, oh my God, wait a minute. We saw the craft sitting there. And that's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I do you have any opinions on what these things are that we consider UFOs? Do you think they're just some cosmic cousins or other races that come from the stars, or do you think perhaps they're multidimensional, or what? Do you have an opinion?
I don't know if I know. I mean, obviously, I don't know for sure. I do believe that they're here, and they're from it's either got to be a multiple dimension or from another planet. Mm-hmm. And they get here using multiple dimensions, or they're obviously able to travel faster than light, or, but yeah, I definitely think there is something to that. I know that there's a lot, just from the people that I've listened to, I know that the government knows a whole lot more than what they're saying, and it would not surprise me at all if they came out tomorrow and they said, oh yeah, we're working with the aliens, they've given us technology, and one of the reasons, I would love to see disclosure, but like I was talking with my wife the other day, and she's like, well, why don't they just tell us? And I said, well, the only two things that I can think of is they're either getting something from the aliens in trade that they don't want us to know about. And the other thing is too, there's so much money from the very rich tied into, energy, petroleum, all of this stuff. And if these UFOs are able to do what they are, they've got basically what would essentially be free energy. And if tomorrow we could all put a box in the back of in our backyard and have free energy, it's going to cut off money to rich people. So they're not going to want that anyway, but it's kind of off on a tangent, but that's my idea on that.
I kind of agree with you. I mean, there's got to be some vested interest or some reason that they're not forthcoming. I think it seems pretty plain to me, and I tried to stay away from, conspiracy ideas just because I don't pretend to be intelligent enough to know or be informed enough to know. But having had experiences myself seeing these craft and talking to so many other people that have, as well as, just being a consumer of the subject matter, it seems really plain to me that they've been here for a long time, or coming and going, or have been here in some form, taking part in our development maybe. But again, the fact that those videos came out the Tic Tac craft, and that seems to be the kind of the big moment in recent history of, maybe we're getting closer to disclosure. But I just think you're right. I think there's too much money involved in it on a corporate or some other level that they're just not willing to, because the ramifications of that would change maybe the dynamic for civilization. And I think a lot of times they used to rely on, we can't let people know, there'd be pandemonium everywhere. The religions would be undermined and all that. And it's like, no, it wouldn't, because when the Tic Tac videos came out, it was like, I don't know what day of the week it is, but just for the sake of argument, it was a Tuesday. They came out, people went, wow, I thought they were real. Yeah. And it was just another day. And it was just that simple. So the whole public panic thing, I don't think is real. That was just a convenient excuse, but now they're just not giving any more excuses. They're just not even, acknowledging it. So it's been a frustrating thing, I think. But, then again, at least they're consistent, because they're not acknowledging any of the stuff that we deal with. And, whether it's ghostly presences and experiences or, cryptids or any of it, they're just, there's nothing to see here, folks. Move along, It's crazy stuff. But in any case, I am just really glad that you're doing what you're doing, because I think that by virtue of recording people's stories, and this is something you and I talked about before the shows, but the one thing that I take away from every story is that I think every story of a person's experience has the opportunity or potential to teach me something about this phenomena. And the fact that so many stories go untold or unrecorded is just such a tragedy to me. So it's people like you that I think are really carrying the burden of, recording this for the rest of us. So thank you so much for what you're doing, brother.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I want to just give a shout out to, my readers out there, if any of them are listening. And I just really appreciate them, because they're, and the people who are willing to share their story and trust me with that. There's no, so much praise I can give them, and thanks that they trust me. So thank you.
Well, again, could you reiterate how people can stay in touch with what you're doing?
Yep. So, you can reach me at strangerbridgerland.com. That's my website. You can contact me there. You can find out about books and about my speaking engagements coming up. You can find all my books on Amazon under Stranger Bridgerland book series. And I've got a little TikTok that I do, which is just Jono243. And I just kind of do little fun things on there. And then I also have a shop there if any of your listeners are interested in a signed copy. I do a signed copy and I write whatever they want to in it. So they can find it there as well. And so please feel free to contact me if you have a story or questions or anything. I love to hear from people. So,
well, I hope you'll come back and we can dive further into all of this. But I had a great time talking with you, brother. And thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. It was a blast. That hour just flew by.
It's the portal. All things get weird in here. But all right. Thank you so much, John, and we'll talk to you again.
Thank you.
Get out!
Guys, thank you so much for joining us here on tonight's show. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please feel free to follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Paranormal Portal Radio, as well as finding us on Twitter. We're on Twitter at Paranormal Portal, PORTL, and we'd love to have you stop by our YouTube page and subscribe and check out our shows there. We got hundreds of shows, Journeys into the Paranormal Portal, so I hope you'll check it out, guys. We're over there at youtube.com/Paranormal Portal, so hope to see you guys soon. We'll be back, of course, for more podcasts in the coming days. So we love you all. Be good, be kind, be nice. Take care of each other. Help each other out. Find the magic in every day. And remember to laugh as much as you can.